Well, hello, and good evening to these fine two gentlemen. I am here with two very special guests today. I am here with Bram Cohen and Gene Hoffman. Gentlemen, how are you guys doing today? It's a pleasure to have you both on.
Good to be here.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Absolutely. I always enjoy having you guys on. Bram, I've had you on once, and Gene, I think you've come on the channel now around 4 or 5 times, but I've never had you guys on together. So I'm very much looking forward to talking to both of you about an assortment of topics surrounding the cypherpunks, surrounding regulatory compliance structures. So let's get to it. So, gentlemen, it's been a while since we've last spoke. So I want to ask you, since that time, many things have occurred. What have you gentlemen been up to since our last discussions?
Bram, you should start.
I've been up to the same stuff as I've always been up to. I'm working on product and engineering, keeping the trains running. I continue to work on peer-to-peer poker is like my big project. But unfortunately, I wish I could just do nothing but code on that. Unfortunately, I'm working on all kinds of other stuff at the same time. So slows that down.
Cool.
And then, obviously, as we said before, we've confidentially filed our S1 with the SEC and have been moving forward on that process. And, are cautiously optimistic about the kind of ongoing demand for enterprise blockchain use cases. One of the biggest things we really want to kind of prove out to the everyman is that these are tools that, now that the technology is much better, really do solve problems for banks, governments, and enterprises, and we're seeing good traction in our pipeline around that.
Absolutely. And you talk about the how technological innovation has accelerated, highlighting that. And I want to ask you two gentlemen this, because both of you are initial cypherpunks. You've been around since the beginning surrounding Bitcoin and blockchain and cryptocurrency as a whole. And I want to ask you gentlemen this, because I think it's a very important question. We're seeing kind of an antithetical approach to blockchain right now, and the initial ethos and zeitgeist of cryptocurrency with the with regulatory encroachment. Both of you being original cypherpunks, do you both see a world where two juxtaposition philosophies can coexist within this industry? Can you see the cypherpunk ethos exist while having regulatory encroachment simultaneously? Is that a possibility?
I mean, the answer we think is yes. And the reason I say that is not all regulations made equal. There's the kind of crazy anarchist or strong left libertarian or strong right libertarian, I want to put it, view that like we don't need government. And then there's only the government can make a decision for everybody. In between there is a heck of a lot of room for government to do the things the government's good at, and for private sector and technology to do what it's good at. And so, when we looked at this situation, as a cypherpunk, you didn't like go out and just immediately start breaking laws. You went out and said, how can we build technology that fits in that regime, that brings more privacy and more control to the end user and ultimately protects us from, the Orwellian state. And, Bitcoin, definitely a, progenitor of technology like BitTorrent, which was also a piece of that, cryptography in general. The opportunity in this sector is to understand kind of the good old laws. And I mean, when I say the good old laws, people sit here saying like the Howey test is 100 years old and doesn't apply. Well, it's like the stuff that they were doing 100 years ago would look exactly like what you've been seeing over the last 3 years. I mean, to the T. It's just a little more global instead of focused on New York this time. And so from that perspective, the whole point of really crypto is, why do we need intermediaries? Why should we have someone who does need regulation if they've got that kind of control over your assets? Mm-hmm. So when you build better technology, you can fit the cypherpunk ethos in to the way the world actually works. And when you take that view, we end up building these tools that aren't susceptible, but really needing regulation. When you do an offer file, no one can really cheat you. I mean, maybe they can front run you a little bit, but barely. And even still, you're getting the assets you asked for. So from that perspective, we think you can marry the two wisely and get rid of the things where regulation is really relevant by just making things trustless there.
Yeah, there's also just really specifically the stuff that the SEC is going after right now. There's different regulations that are very different from each other, right? A lot of the stuff that the SEC is going after right now is these very old rules that basically say you can't make a business and then sell all the equity to just random yabos like retail, like poor people, and then generate a lot of hype and make the price go way up and dump all your holdings and then get out before it succeeds or fails or anything and just leave everybody else holding the bag and you weren't even in real business. And a lot of a bunch of VCs are especially bad here. A bunch of people are like, hey, great, we have crypto now. Crypto is not an equity. We can go ahead and do these activities. and started doing that en masse. And whether the old rules actually do apply to cryptocurrencies or not is kind of a lot of the contention right now. But the idea that like the great innovation of cryptocurrency is the ability to like dump your holdings really fast onto retail when you start a venture is not a cause I support or believe in or care about. There are other regulations that are very scary and bad, like potential applications of KYC rules could be extremely bad for cryptocurrency, and a very, very poor application of those. But just the basic like things covered by the Howey test, just from a moral standpoint, really what we're talking about here is the ability to dump your holdings really quickly. That's the issue we're talking about here.
Yeah, and I mean, look, the issue very simply is that if you want to do an entrepreneurial activity, we know how to do that. Even Uber knew how to comply with securities laws, and they weren't exactly comply with everything laws kind of company. And so that is in many ways the original sin. And it's so not cypherpunk to have handed the SEC complete regulatory control over your future by simply trying to evade the rules, right? Now, what is cypherpunk is truly peer-to-peer DeFi. There isn't a need to be a registered exchange when it's truly peer-to-peer DeFi, because all of the reasons that were very valid to want to have registration of national stock exchanges don't apply when it's peer-to-peer and it's truly peer-to-peer. So, it's really marrying the best of both worlds. It's taking the technology places it can go. And, as much as I totally agree that KYC could be badly, badly handled, banks may need KYC to offer a certificate of deposit directly on chain. And we want to give banks those tools to do that for their application, but not for like native Chia.
Yeah, when you have an exchange that's a custodial exchange where everyone's just handing it all of their stuff and it's keeping track of who has what as it executes trades, obviously that should be regulated because it should be against the law for it to just go, oh, thanks everybody, and just disappear with everyone's stuff. That's very, very bad. But when you actually have yes, we've seen that scam in what is supposedly crypto and isn't really at all. But when you have true peer-to-peer exchange, which we have in Chia, then you have non-custodial exchange activities, and you don't have the same need for these same regulations on that because there's no entity that's sitting on everyone's stuff.
Of course. And you guys make a very important point here that I think that cryptocurrency tends to overgeneralize and categorize these regulatory encroachments and also this regulatory compliance as all under the same umbrella. I think that when we look at mostly when we see on Twitter or we see YouTube live streams or we see informative articles or lack thereof, they tend to create this overarching umbrella term surrounding regulation, but they don't go into the in-depth notion of the different types of regulation that exist within blockchain. What are the benefits and what are the detriments of certain types of regulation? Not to mention the fact that we have a maturing market. And to presume that a maturing market would not have some type of regulatory compliance structure is a bit overly utopian in a lot of ways, I think. So I want to ask you two gentlemen this question because both of you are original cypherpunks. And I want to ask you both this. What was the zeitgeist of that particular time period or that particular group of people that stood out the most to both of you to have you participate in it?
I'm a weirdo who just likes working on network protocols. It's kind of the. I mean, it's much more fun working on cryptography than it is doing, I don't know, websites or something. But a lot of my interest really always has been just legitimately in, I like working on this stuff. I like building these things. And I happen to be very, very good at network protocols and cryptography. And
there you go.
And hence I just sort of, without really trying that hard, wound up in this thing. Original cypherpunks were a bunch of goofy weirdos, and kind of a diverse lot, and a really small group of people when it comes down to it. A lot of what people talk about now is actually, there was kind of the same sorts of splits as you see now. A lot of the ones people talk about now from back then were these very loud, colorful characters who, for the most part, didn't actually do stuff. They were just loud, colorful characters. And some of them were mentally unwell. And there's some people who I told people, this person is kind of a homicidal psycho and you should stay away from him. He's mentally unwell and not someone you should support. And friends of mine did not always heed my advice about those things. But I stayed away from that. There was definitely a divide of, there's the people who actually get stuff done, and there's the people who, rant and rave about politics. And if you were around at the time, it's always the people who rant and rave publicly seem a lot more important because they're much more visible. They make a point of that's their whole role is making themselves visible. Where the people who are actually building stuff are kind of, antisocial and introverted and working on this super technical stuff that's hard to understand what they're talking about, even when trying to have a discussion with them about what they're doing. So there were definitely both of those threads, but there's, these very, very old projects of like HTTPS, right? And it's now called TLS, right? That's a very, very old thing that became, that went from being this kind of edgy thing that was thrown in kind of last minute at Netscape to something that's just viewed as like vital to national security and is just ubiquitous for almost all internet connections these days, right? There's also things with like, hard drive encryption that, of course, a big deal is not made out of that, but almost like, I don't know about almost everything. A lot of things just encrypt the hard drive locally, and they don't really tell you they're doing that. It's just a feature that's thrown in there. Hard drives are encrypted. It's just done. You always encrypt the damn hard drive. And these were projects that didn't really require that many people or that much engineering. There wasn't like that much stuff going on. There was the horrible scam of buying certificates online. I'm still bitter about this one. That it's always been this policy in web browsers that they won't simply connect to something and just accept whatever cert it gives them and do opportunistic encryption, right? So this is a form of encryption which will make it so that someone who's just passively watching the traffic can't read what's happening here. And it requires an actually active attack to read the messages going back and forth. And, way back in the day, the idea that someone would actually pull off an active attack was just insane. Just nobody had the resources to do that shit. Now it's pretty common. Like ISPs will man in the middle all of people's traffic all the time. It's not that uncommon. But right. But it was crazy that you couldn't at least just make a certificate if you felt like it and have your web traffic be encrypted. And then you could get a root cert for extra security to be told so that the users would be told that it's secure. But that wasn't required. This was just a stupid argument that was going on in cypherpunks that only got ended because it got so easy to get certs that it's not a big deal anymore. But it was always just dumb. And it just drove me insane that people were insistent. No, we have to We have to do this anyhow. So the certificate authorities were making just ungodly amounts of money for just horrifically bad service for a really long time as a result of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the TLS versus PGP Web of Trust fight was no fun at all. But the folks who did things at the cypherpunks were definitely motivated by a new vision, both of horribles and possibilities. And the horribles were, what we all found out the NSA was actually doing. Like, it was not hard as a cypherpunk in the late 90s to look at the network and go, somebody with enough money and time could really cause everyone to have all of their email read everywhere. This is not a good idea. And the flip side of it was that, you could, for the first time ever, really, in individual hands, be able to guarantee like a conversation between the three of us can only be spilled by the three of us. That's such a kind of huge change, right? Now, it's still porous. Like, if Bram decides he wants to go tell the FBI that we've said bad things in this conversation, well, he's still free to do that. But now the FBI can't do it themselves. And that was a real kind of opening of what could be possible. And it became very clear, too, that internet money growing directly out of what we were seeing with public key cryptography and identity and PKI made a lot of sense, but had some problems that needed to be solved. And thank you, Satoshi, for finally getting the last bits of those.
Absolutely. And I agree. It's very interesting because unfortunately I was not able to be a cypherpunk because it was very much unfortunately before my time. I was born in 95. So I was 5 years old during that type of cypherpunk. So, I wish. But I want to talk to you, gentlemen, because you alluded to this before, Gene, about the IPO. And I know that you have to be, I understand that you can't talk specifics in a lot of ways. So I understand that. So we spoke about the Chia IPO in our last conversation. And without going into too much details, how is Chia then, through this IPO, embodying both the original principles of blockchain while being in compliance with regulatory structures?
So one of the problems for Bitcoin has been that, when it launched, it was such a radical concept that it really couldn't do the things we're going to be able to do with Chia to think forward about financing development and being able to kind of have the underlying support. I mean, so that developers get paid to continue building, because it turns out that, I don't think we're going to be done figuring out what blockchains look like anytime soon, in the same way we're still not really done with HTML, right? So from that perspective, we had the opportunity, because Satoshi has gone and done the risky step, that we could actually do something that is a little bit more centralized, where there is a central entity that does have a developer fund. But the thing is, then you get into, okay, so how do you govern that? And everybody on the planet has tried to rewrite a homeowners association on chain with bad outcomes left and right. And we have this technology. It's called a 400-year-old technology called joint stock corporations. And it's evolved as public companies in the United States to being one of the best governance tools we've had. It's not perfect. Enron happens. But at the same time, we really couldn't think of a better structure to be able to give certainty to what's going on, what we commit to, how we continue to fund that development, how it's profit motivated in the sense of serving our customers on the blockchain and making money off of that, while giving most of it away for free. Or in fact, just like Red Hat, if you don't want to use us and you do want to use an enterprise use case, you can skip us. But we think a lot of people like Red Hat and like others will want to use the domain experts to really deploy major applications.
Right.
So, for our perspective, it was about the very best path, and it's a well-worn path. And then, if you look closely at all of the SEC complaints against projects that have sold coins to investors, they all say that they did that without a registration statement. And this gets to the point of the public policy of the original 33 Securities Act. The idea is that, when you had a bill company and you had a real auditor and you had a real business and you were able to disclose all those details, now you could sell stuff to retail. And so it opens up our ability to potentially use the pre-farm, because we have that ongoing registered status. So, even if as a matter of law, the Chia coin's a commodity, we probably could sell it today. We think it's even better to go ahead and do at least the policy prescriptions, so that, in all senses, all of those checkboxes are checked. And we lose very little, other than, I wish for someone who's not Bram and I that this hard. Like, it should be a little easier, but it should fundamentally be the same basic process.
Absolutely. No, I appreciate you guys making that distinction, because I think it's very important. Because when we see many people discussing the cypherpunk ethoses of cryptocurrency, the DeFi notion of cryptocurrency, while simultaneously seeing the maturation of this market surrounding what's happening with BlackRock, what's happening with all of these ETFs now being filed as a result. Now Jerome Powell comes out today and says that there's staying power in cryptocurrency. It seems like there, even though it's, I would dare say, paradoxical, there is a way for blockchain projects and blockchain as a whole to be able to amalgamate successfully the principles of DeFi and what the cypherpunk stood for without being so anarcho, and realizing that there is some sort of regulatory compliance that is somewhat needed in this space. So I absolutely agree with you, so that we don't necessarily see another FTX, for example. So I want to ask you guys this then, because over the last 2 weeks, a lot has happened. We saw Gary Gensler sue Binance and Coinbase, and not Gary Gensler, the SEC, and I think it was 15 different cryptocurrencies were labeled securities. ADA, File, Dash, Solana, Polygon. They were alleged that they were securities. And now we have a new exchange platform that's backed by Fidelity, Charles Schwab, and Citadel, which is called EDX Markets. What do you think is actually going on surrounding the maturation of this space from a traditional financial and hedge fund perspective?
Well, so I still think there's one mistake being made a little bit by Wall Street, and they're treating these assets like they're an asset class, and they're actually rivalrous technologies. And in that sense, there are, I do think, these assets that will go up in value because demand to use them for things exists. And I mean, I guess digital gold is a demand for a use of something. And so I can see, a Bitcoin ETF being a gold ETF, right?
Yes.
But that's not really kind of the point. I mean, the point of blockchains and cryptocurrencies are to enable markets that trade and that use that trade to create value and, to solve real world problems. And, one of my views is that the kind of, well, I think I've said this before, it's the French Revolution versus the American Revolution style of revolution, right? There's a lot of folks in the core crypto side, and there's part of the cypherpunks this way, that it's the French Revolution. If we don't destroy it all, we haven't won. And I'm much more of the American Revolution. I don't really necessarily want to destroy Wall Street. I want to narrow their margins, make their trading cheaper, make it more accessible to everybody, while firmly entrenching all of the important points about pseudonymity, ultimately anonymity, and infrastructure that a Bitcoin layer 1, a Chia layer 1 enables.
Yeah,
because the way these things are enduring is because everybody uses them.
Yes. Yeah, the French Revolution didn't go so well.
No, it didn't. You had the Vendée, which was basically the mass slaughtering of the peasant class. You had the Reign of Terror. You had multiple different constitutions being written. You had then it basically turned back into the Ancien regime with Napoleon. So basically, as a result of tearing the Ancien regime down, you created a proto Ancien regime with the ability for Napoleon to rise to power, which basically wreaked havoc on Europe for the first 2 decades of the 19th century. So I agree with you. You both gentlemen make a really important point around the French Revolution, where the French Revolution created a calamity and a power vacuum in not only France, but Europe as well. And it created terror, it created death, it created so many unfortunate aspects that, although it did change France, was the French Revolution effective? That's up to debate with a lot of historians. So as opposed to the American Revolution was able to establish a new nation. Yes, we had the Articles of Confederation, which really weren't a success, in my opinion. You had Shays' Rebellion. You had all these different aspects that occurred right after the inception of the United States. But all in all, it was able to create a functioning nation. So I agree with you 100% with that distinction. And as a historian, I appreciate you making that up, making that distinction up, because I think
well, at a high level, it's like when you have a revolution, it doesn't really usher in utopia. There is no utopia to usher in. It's just like you could break some stuff, but what do you do after that? And these days, a lot of the revolutionary movements have become much more successful because they're pro-democracy movements. That the goal if your goal is, well, we're going to get rid of the bad people and install good people, then inevitably you get rid of the bad people, install the new people. It's like, well, they aren't as good as we thought they were, so let's just get rid of them and install the new good people. And this never ends. Where if you go, well, we're just going to have an election, if that's the whole goal, and whoever wins the election is now the new, president.
Absolutely.
Or maybe you have a parliamentary system. But if that's your goal, that's an achievable goal that you can get to, where you did not promise utopia, but it was a milestone that you could get to and declare victory and stop having a revolution anymore.
Absolutely. And I want to ask you, gentlemen, this question now about decentralization, because I think decentralization is a very important component of cryptocurrency and blockchain. I think it's one of the main ethoses of why cryptocurrency was created. So how is Chia positioning itself to be one of the most decentralized blockchains on the planet? And why is decentralization an important component of blockchain that shouldn't ever dissipate, no matter how regulatory this ecosystem becomes?
Well, it's really about security, right? The goal is to have security, to have confidence that, in the case of blockchain, a lot of it is about finality, but also about the rules of custody and such that are enforced are actually getting enforced the way you think they are. That when people are interacting with other people about money, you don't want the money walking away in weird, unexpected, mysterious ways. It's very important that you have high confidence that that's not happening. So if the point to decentralization for something like this is there's no one entity who can just walk back the state of the database, who could just change what's in there. And there's levels of this. There's the ability to walk it back and rerun and do different transactions. There's also potentially, depending on how the database runs, someone could just completely change the balances willy-nilly. These are things that you, generally speaking, don't want to happen with money, or at least if they can happen, there are rules about who can do what when, not just a rando attacker of some kind just attacks everything and messes it all up. So that's the goal. That's the value that you have there, right? And Chia is, in fact, actually extremely decentralized. The network, if you just measure by Nakamoto coefficient, would require a huge number of participants in order to attack it. And this is largely a function of using it's just a better protocol. We have a consensus algorithm which uses resources that are widely distributed that don't have economies of scale. So we have a high Nakamoto coefficient. We have the standard pooling protocol is one where it's not the pool that makes the blocks, it's the farmer that makes the blocks, which also helps quite a bit. The way the on-chain semantics work is a very auditable, well, that doesn't have to do with decentralization, but it makes it so that you don't have these kind of like de facto centralized applications running on chain. Each coin has its own rules, and it's not like there's some contract that everyone sends their funds to, where the contract actually has a backdoor in it to allow it to get upgraded and to get security fixes thrown in, but also makes it so that in principle, whoever has those keys can just gank everything at any time. So we've made a lot of these architectural decisions, some of which required real technical innovations to do, that do in fact just straightforwardly and measurable ways make it a lot more decentralized and hence more secure and reliable.
And look, it really matters when you talk about people with either real money or real power. And what I mean by that is, when you talk about governments working with governments, it's international law. And, at the end of the day, international law is whose aircraft carriers are bigger. And so from that perspective, being able to give governments the ability to do like a peer-to-peer DeFi offer transaction in a way that is trustless, other than, agreeing that that's the deal between them, escrowless, and this goes through, this has kind of not existed before. And when blockchains get to scale, major commercial banks, governments, spy agencies, these are your users. And if you are not ready for those users and are not truly decentralized such that those users can't easily persuade a small group of people to do something that might not exactly be what everybody else wants to have happen, you're not ready to play the game.
Absolutely, very well said. I think that many protocols right now are not ready to play this game. They're not ready to understand the intricacies of cryptocurrency and blockchain and how it can actually have real-world application for not only the private sector but also nation states as well. And I think that the retail needs to understand that that this is coming, that this maturation where blockchain is being utilized by nation states and by the private sector is coming. It's basically already here in a lot of ways. So I think that's a very, very important point to make. And sorry,
One little thing is I was going to jump in on one little thing.
Go ahead.
Something we've been seeing recently is that in certain sectors, it was really clear that like businesses in that sector should be using blockchains. And we'd find that there's like one really wide holdout, like some entity, a major bank, a major game company didn't do anything. And what we're finding is that those folks were in fact the most sophisticated. They had looked at the market, they looked at the state of the market and went, we have an app, we'd like to do something here, but the technology is just not ready. And so they've actually started to be some of our best initial customers when we walk in and explain that, we've actually addressed the significant issues that enterprises and governments have to use a blockchain. And they're the ones most gung-ho because they're finally like, our implementation on a blockchain isn't a waste on a private blockchain. This is a public blockchain. We can go do things and they'll have network effects and be part of the overall, fabric of the economy. And that's interesting. So it's been fascinating to see it with the holdouts who look like they're going to be the early adopters.
Absolutely. I can imagine. I mean, I personally am very curious to see the I don't want to use the word fallout, the after effects of the early adopters and how that will shape the private sector and may even shape the public sector. I think it's shaping the public sector right before our eyes, and many people are kind of seeing that now with a lot of these hedge funds and these regulatory entities coming in and realizing the value that this space has to offer the private sector as well, and nation states. And I want to ask you both. We actually have a question in the chat from Cookies. He says, what does a Chia Lightning 3.0 payment channel look like?
Well, I don't know if we're up to 3, and I don't know if we're exactly on Lightning here either. So I'm working on developing payment channels here. I'm working on developing full-blown state channels. So on a purely technical level, it's got some features of what's called L2 ELTOO. So the channel itself is just like a regular coin. That's like a 2 of 2 spend to it. That's all it is. And the two counterparties to it are using what amounts to HTLCs to do some tricks with it. So the things that they sign basically are saying, okay, this is going to this state. And when it goes to this state, it can either, after some timeout, go to another state that's specified, or it can be preempted with something. So each possible state that this can unroll to corresponds to some virtual state that was created, right? Generally speaking, when you have a state channel, the two counterparties who are interacting with each other are pretending that this coin that they have has now been spent and formed these other coins. And they are updating the state of what those coins are over time to new things. And at some point you unroll it and those virtual coins become real coins. So there's 2 phases of this. The first one is figuring out what the virtual coins that should be made real are, which is basically what is the most recent version of these things. And then following that, there's whatever you were doing over those virtual coins, instead of doing it virtually, you now do it actually on chain, and which hopefully isn't that much business. But with Chia, you can actually be like playing poker because it has the capability of doing that, which you don't really have in Bitcoin. But what my plan is, and this is right now a plan, I have not implemented this yet, coming up to it soon, is that the rules for unrolling are you and I are talking to each other, and we have sequence numbers of the version of the state of things. So there's some 2 of 2 thing that's my key and your key. And we have sequence numbers, and like I have the even numbers and you have the odd numbers. Okay. And so when the thing unrolls, the thing it unrolls to knows its state number. And so if it's like if it's an even number, that means that this is, I was sending you even numbers, right? So the way I create something of the latest version is I say, okay, here's the new state. I'm signing it with my half of the key. So you could introduce this now. And then when you ping pong it back to me, now you sign something with a higher number and send that to me, but it's an odd number. Okay. And now I update to ignore. So what's going to happen here is if something with an even number showed up, you countersigned the thing that I had sent you already, right? That I sent you saying, okay, this is state, 4 at some point, and then maybe there was a later thing, maybe there wasn't, but now you decided, okay, I want to make this hit the chain. So you countersign state 4, and it goes out with state 4. And the rule with state 4, because it's an even number, it can either exit to a pre-specified set of coins just via a timeout. A timeout has happened, so now it turns into an anyone can spend with that timeout, or it can also get spent immediately with a larger odd sequence number, right? This is to make it so that you can't just retroactively take an old state of things and make that happen. So if you countersign state 4, but then that's a very old one, and so at some point you had sent me state 7, I can go, no, we're going to state 7. And so I take the unrolling to state 4, and I take the signature of state 7 and say, see here, this is state 7. We're going to that immediately. This is a little bit different and simpler than the proposals that have been done for EL200. Because by keeping track of the even odd thing, it makes it so you can't repeatedly up over and over again, and it just makes that whole process a lot simpler. It doesn't support like watchtowers as well. Because of that, some features could be added to add support for watchtowers, which also make it a little bit more complicated. But I think that's probably best done by making it so you have an explicit concept of update via watchtower, which is different from update via the counterparty. Because if a watchtower updates, then it might be that it can you can possibly re-up from what a watchtower said, and where when the actual entity introduces their thing, that should be final. You should get one crack at it because you have the latest thing. It shouldn't be this docile back and forth to happen. Anyhow, that's that's what I am building right now. Some of the not having watchtower support thing is when you're doing gaming, like your watchtower can really screw you no matter what, because you get these things where you kind of have to trust your watchtower because you're giving it your whole cards, right? Because if you need to be able to just show your hand sometimes. So you're actually giving it information to show that you weren't cheating, which means that it knows the secret state that you have. So the watchtower could collude with your opponent to leak that information to them, and now they beat you at the game. So for that reason, I'm not really worrying too much about watchtowers at the moment, because that is sort of an interesting subject of how do you make good watchtowers, but gets much, much more difficult for a full-blown state channel than for a simple payment channel. And it's also just extra features. I'm trying to build an MVP. It's hard enough just getting this basic stuff done. Anyhow, that's my slightly long-winded explanation of how on a pretty technical level the actual state channels work.
No, and I appreciate that greatly. And I want to just bring up to everyone in the chat, if you're new to the channel, make sure to go in the description and follow Gene on Twitter, Gene Hoffman on Twitter. I have the official Chia website in the description. I have Gene Hoffman's Keybase as well. I have Bram Cohen's Wikipedia if you want to learn about his his work as well surrounding BitTorrent and Chia. You can also check that out. I have the BitTorrent website. And also please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. I've had Gene on about 4 times, and Bram, this is his 2nd time on, so please make sure to do that. And I just want to ask one last question, and then there are a few questions that the community wants to ask. So with your guys' permission, we'll go to those. So gentlemen, you both have been in blockchain from the very beginning, and now watching it mature, or at least trying to mature. Where do you expect blockchain to be in, let's say, 5 to 10 years from now, and where do you want to see Chia by the end of the decade?
Well, by the end of the decade, a lot of the stuff that we're working on now will have become mature, at least on a technical level. It will be fleshed out. So there's all this like really, really basic functionality of like being able to specify custodial arrangements, right? This thing that I get I view as very important. I get really excited about getting to build and deploy and stuff, and most people don't, because it's like, hey, what you really want is a multi-sig where, like, if different sets of keys get into an argument about what should happen, then the larger numbers of keys wins, right? Like, that's like really basic functionality that involves a bunch of work about timeouts and stuff to actually build it, that people aren't doing except on Chia. And you know, having like a lot more things tokenized on chain, and having, you know, real liquid markets in those things, especially but not limited to carbon credits. These are things that will very much be a thing by the end of the decade. And I think this is really, I don't know about the rest of the industry. I think this is going to be a lot of like the real value of blockchains in general will be coming from Chia specifically, doing this kind of stuff. But to the extent that other cryptocurrencies are producing real value, it is likely to be in the same kind of a vein that I'm hoping. I hope, but do not expect for there to be a lot less of this Ponzi shit that we've been seeing.
I can imagine. With regulatory compliance structures, I'm sure that'll be nullified at least a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Look, there's going to be a limited number of blockchains that survive to the end of the decade. You know, you're going to certainly see Bitcoin be one of them. We believe Chia is going to be one of them. I think you're going to see a lot of pressure on Bitcoin to be more compatible with Chia. You've already seen it a little bit with ordinals and BRC20, which is absolutely inspired by what we've been doing with NFT1 and CATS. And PBSTs now becoming a thing again, which are very similar to offers. So I think you see that. You know, I think Solidity will not die, but I think Solidity is going to be a much more narrow kind of maybe degen only sort of thing, just because, you know, the people who have third party risk on their money, you know, bank money, insurance company money, they care a lot differently about security and how that all works. And I think you're going to find that, you know, the Chia list / Bitcoin style of security is so much more trustworthy over the long haul to be able to move billions to trillions.
Absolutely. No, and I want to say to both of you gentlemen, thank you so much for answering my questions. And we have a few questions in the chat. I know we have about 15 minutes left. With your permission, would I be able to ask those questions?
Absolutely, though we do have to stop at the top of the hour.
Absolutely, that's totally fine. I completely understand. So, the first question that I see is, will state channels be able to take advantage of multi-sig to expand to more than 2 parties?
Well, when you have, I haven't thought about more than 2 parties all that much. They're a real pain. A bunch of things happen because when you have more than 2 parties, you could have situations where 2 of them collude against a third one, right? And that can really mess things up. So I've really been exclusively thinking about 2 parties, and also for the gaming I'm building, I'm really just doing 2-player games for similar, you know, analogous reasons that just a lot of painful things happen with 3. However, that said, as far as multi-sig goes, actually you're using multi-sig even just for 2, just for a bilateral connection. There's no reason not to use a BLS layer 2 of 2 multi-sig for doing that. It just saves you, you know, transaction costs to do things that way. It's just a better way of approaching things.
Absolutely. So we have a very introspective question by Slowest Time Lord. He said, to both of you having successful businesses and exits in the past, I would imagine money is no longer your main motivation in how you choose to leave your legacy. What is both of your motivations now?
Oh, money has never been a big motivation for me, which it's funny because there's a lot of douchey business bro types who get really triggered by that, who just get extremely jealous that someone who's not materialistic is doing well, and stop just short of saying that if I don't care about money, I should give it to them, because obviously douchey business bros are the greatest charity in the world. I'm a very not materialistic person. I mean, I care about it. I tend to take whatever money I make, put it to making the world a better place. I think that's a good thing to do in general. I tend to take care of my corporeal incarnation well enough that I can continue to be productive. But I always am motivated by, changing the world. What impact does this have on the world in general, and what does it make happen? And I think making the simple goal of greasing the wheels of commerce is very much worth doing. It just kind of makes the world better for everyone, not in a way that's like really necessarily taking down the man. I mean, it's sort of taking down some people who are making too much money, but it doesn't, you don't get this like righteous, like I'm destroying bad people kind of take out of doing that, but it makes the world, better all around for everyone in ways that aren't super specifically like this thing here is like magically transformed. It just makes everything better everywhere.
Absolutely.
Yeah, look, at night when I'm worried about something, it's not whether I'm going to get paid or not. It is whether or not this blockchain has become ubiquitously accepted, right? And I do worry about that project, right? It's like, what are the things between, here and you just assume it as part of the internet that we have to do to make sure that occurs? And so, that's what gets me out of bed in the morning, is trying to make sure that we get to that promised land where, in the same breath as TCP, the web, and, a blockchain, it's synonymous with what is the Chia blockchain effectively.
Absolutely. And I want to say to everyone in the chat, thank you so much for the super chat. Steve Step, $5. Monkey Zoo, 5. Chia Dog, good work. Corey, thank you so much for the $2 super chat. Thank you so much, VTR, for the $5 super chat. He said, great to see Bram and Gene. What does Bram think about ZK rollups versus the Lightning Network?
Oh, it's not really a versus thing. There's trade-offs here. And also when you're talking about rollups, there's a distinction between rollups and side chains. People do not use these words, this vernacular super consistently, but there's basically things where whatever updates are done, the fact of the update, the information about what the update is, has to be posted to chain. And then there's which can get you like a constant factor improvement in scaling, but not more than that, because you do have to in the end post what it is that actually happened on chain. And for transactions below some threshold of complexity, the ZK costs you more than just validating the transactions on chain. And then there's side chains where you just publish like a root of the update that happened. And those ones pretty critically need some kind of proof of publication to happen, or just the whole thing can get bricked, and it's horrible. Although I think for an awful lot of projects, they're just doing the thing where you're just sort of trusting them to keep everything, and no one else could actually in practice update it. So that's that's a little not more than a little disingenuous and not good. Anyhow, proof of publication is a really interesting and actually surprisingly difficult problem. Okay, so I should probably explain what these things are. The zero knowledge proofs, you're not showing the thing, you're showing that the thing exists, right? You're saying, here are the rules of the sidechain, and I am saying like a bunch of transactions were done on the sidechain, and here is the new state of it, and I am showing you that it is valid. This has some scaling benefits to it. Like I said, something somewhere needs to have the stuff. You need to show somebody has it, right? It's kind of an elephant gun approach to scaling. It's like a big fancy piece of technology that comes with significant costs to it. But it's just this big fancy thing to use that can solve a lot of problems. Where state channels are much less fancy. They're just kind of subtle. They're not using any super interesting math. And they don't just fix everything for you. You need to start thinking about how do things work in state channels to do this. It does get shown to you a bit. However, it has the benefit that it can really get your latencies down extremely low. Mm-hmm. I don't want to say instantaneous because nothing is instantaneous, but there are things that are much, much faster than other things. So it can get your latencies down to a scale of seconds rather than minutes for various things to happen. So when you're really approaching scaling problems, you really should start with state channels and do as much as you can over those before you really start getting fancy and doing zero knowledge stuff.
Absolutely.
But ZK is like a cool, shiny, fun thing to play with. So, you know,
No, I appreciate you making that distinction. And I just want to say, I know we have about 8 minutes left. There are a few more questions.
Sure.
Digital Spaceport, thank you for the $2 super chat. And R, thank you for the $10 super chat. David Ducato, thank you for the $6 super chat. And he asked, how is the climate action data trust going? Has there been any transactions for the CADT?
So can't comment that on a good way. So news soon.
Okay. All right. Monkey Zoo, I saw asked a question before. He said, is there any alpha we could discuss about the Chia IPO? I'm not sure how far you could
Go into that description.
Yeah, we can't. It's filed. We're comfortable with the process, and that's all we can really talk about right now.
Absolutely. So we have about 7 minutes left, guys. Does anybody have any last minute questions that they would like to ask that I may have missed throughout the chat? I know the chat's been very lively. There's about 85 of you in here right now. And I know there's about another 20 of you watching on Twitter. So it's about 105 people watching right now. So we have 5 minutes left, or about 6 minutes left. So if you have any questions that I haven't asked these two fine gentlemen yet, please let me know. If not, make sure to go in the description and follow Gene and Bram on Twitter. If you haven't yet, make sure to check out Chia, which I have in the the description as well. I have a website in the description. Let me see what else. Someone said scroll up. I have a question, so let's see. What does Bram think about compressed plots?
Well, all plots are compressed a lot, right, to begin with. So what the goal has always been is to make it so that the available levels of compression available to everyone are equal to everybody, right? And so the idea is you get some theoretical maximum of compression that you could possibly have, and make it so that everyone's using the same thing and they're all in a level playing field here, right? So there are some we did a whole batch of trying to get everything we could. We did not, it turns out, squeeze all the blood from the stone. There have been some improvements relatively recently on that. So I think it's just a matter of, in the future, everyone will be using, the latest and greatest there. But it's not like there's going to be a never ending stream of these things. You get this like asymptotic improvements where different techniques can be used, and eventually you just kind of run out of techniques. So we're getting the latest stuff gets probably most of the way towards what's left. There's probably another like 2 or 3% that can be squeezed out even on top of that we kind of have in the pipeline here. But yeah.
Cool.
Thank you so much, Johannes, for the 5 super chat. Thank you so much. I think we have time for one more question, then I think we're going to end it. Thank you so much again, David, for the super chat, the other super chat. Leo asked, after CNI goes public, will the 21 million still be a commodity?
We believe so. It certainly can't become a security until somebody like ourselves sell it. But in the same way that the law is pretty clear, there's no really way for a security to become a commodity, except in the derivatives and forward futures. We think the law is equally clear that a commodity can't become a security. And even to the extent someone was concerned it does, we've done all of the items that the Securities Act want you to do, the disclosure, the audits, the ongoing reporting requirements. So there's not really any additional policy requests that could be made. So we're pretty confident that we'll be able to use it. But over time, we're not in a rush. It's not yet time.
That said, I don't think that gives Ethereum a clean bill of health, because it would be pretty easy to make the argument that ETH1 was a commodity but no longer exists, and now we have ETH2, which is not a commodity. I am not making a legal statement about whether that's true or not. I'm saying that's definitely a legal argument that can be made.
ETH is a very complicated set of arguments, and the big key that's different between us and ETH is nothing that even looks like XDH has ever been sold by us for money.
There you go. So I know we have to stop now at the top of the hour, and I just wanted to give an outro and thank these two fine gentlemen for what they've done since the inception of blockchain and the inception of cryptocurrency, the inventions they've created, the participation that they've facilitated within this realm of industry, this budding industry. And all I can say wholeheartedly is thank you so much, both of you, for your time. I know I try to have you on, Gene, at least once every 2 months. Bram, I love having you on. I love your technical expertise and what you've done with BitTorrent as well. And it's an honor to have two initial cypherpunks on the channel. So I want to say wholeheartedly thank you so much for both of your time.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Absolutely. All right, guys, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Follow Gene on Twitter. Follow Bram on Twitter. Make sure to check out the Chia website, which I have in the description. Make sure to check out all the links if you want to learn more about this great product and this great ecosystem. And again, I just want to say thank you so much for the community. Thank you for all those who donated. And I will see you guys in the next episode. You guys be well, okay? Have a great rest of your week.
Bye, everybody.
Take care, everybody. Be well. Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay.
Hey, everyone.
Okay.